Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We see several familiar names, so thank you for joining in for today's session. So hope everyone's keeping well and safe today. And really, time flies. Today, we're going to have our third edition of the Singapore webinar series. My name is Daniel, and today we have our very own sports scientist, Dan Duffield, joining us today. So Dan has a degree in exercise and sports science and has been with the company for 8 years now. So with his vast experience working with various organizations from the Australian, European, and US regions, his extensive experience in the implementation of smarter base with the various departments and levels of the sport, military, performing arts industries, we will be sure to garner heaps of knowledge from today's webinar. So for today, when we talk about data, it's not about the size, but how relevant we can make sense out of it. So what we're going to do with all these massive loads of information we have on our hand. So really the goal is to turn this data into information and information into valuable insights. Yeah. So our topic today is completing the performance picture with data. And then it's going to share with us what kind of information will be really good to know about, and also how we're going to put the data together to make meaningful information out of it. So one final thing before I hand it over to Dan, we'll be happy to take any of your questions along the call. So you may use the chat function located down below your screen. And there will also be a Q&A session at the end of it as well. So yeah, without further ado, just gonna hand it over to Dan. Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Daniel. Appreciate that introduction, and yeah, welcome to everybody on the call today. Really appreciate your time and the opportunity to share some of this knowledge that we've gained. With our time working with SmarterBase, we've been able to work in a lot of different organizations and learn a lot about how to use data effectively. I think the way that I'd like to go through this today is talk first and foremost about, I guess, the philosophy of an organization and how you kind of come up with the technologies and the data sets that are useful in your organization. And then use a bit of a case study that we did internally to design the dashboard that's on the screen right now, and then talk to a couple of client examples at the end of how we've seen this used in other situations. So one of the big things that is really important when you're designing any kind of visualization to feedback to coaches is you want to start with a question that you're trying to answer. If you start with a question, from there, you're able to decide what you want to show the coaches. And then also you can work back from there to understand which of the data points that you collect are important. So I think it's first and foremost, the coming up with a question, your responsibility might be you're a sports scientist or a strength conditioning coach. So you have a very performance focus. You need to make sure that your athletes are in a position to train or to compete. And so what's important to you is going to be different to, say, a physiotherapist, a physical therapist, a trainer who their goal is to prevent injury, or primary goal is to prevent injury. So that's really important to distinguish between people's roles. But I think just on an organization level, understanding first and foremost the demands of your sport. And then once you understand the demands of your sport, understanding the types of data that help you understand those demands of the sport. So for our example today, what I'm going to show is an internal study we did. We had 3 or 4 of us, and we had several data sets available to us. And the question that we wanted to answer was, what type of session are my athletes ready for today? So I think we know that there are a lot of different things that can influence the performance of an athlete, whether it's the way they slept last night, how they perceive their wellness, if they're reporting any muscle soreness, previous training loads. And we could even go to the level of measuring someone's neuromuscular output, through things like counter movement jumps or their CNS through different kind of wearable technology. So for our example today, what we're going to look at is 5 different pieces of data that we thought were important to answer the question of what type of session my athletes are ready for. So what you'll see just on the visual that we're looking at here is there's three main tables, and what each table represents is the type of training session that the athlete is essentially able to do based on the data that we've collected on them. And within each of these tables, you'll see that they're pretty much the same except for the colors that represent them. But we've got 5 data sets. We've got a value of sleep coming from a wearable technology. In this case, it was what's called an Oura Ring. The second one is a measure of their central nervous system readiness using a technology called Omega Wave. We've got self-reported wellness, which we collect through the mobile app. RSI using a jump mat. We used our smart jump technology for that. And then finally, load was just an RPE rating. You can use wearable technology like a GPS or even your Garmin devices or your Polar, but we just wanted some sort of measure of load to indicate how much training we were doing. And so what we did was we decided that those were the 5 key components that would indicate an athlete's readiness to train. And then what we did was we built, in Smarterbase, we built an algorithm and we weighted each of these metrics based on their importance or what we felt the importance was to the training. So, we know that when you're trying to do power, your central nervous system needs to be at its peak. It needs to be functioning well. We also know that you need to be well rested for this type of thing. And ideally, you don't want to be having too high loads leading into it. But some of those things we weighted more heavily than others. Based on that, if people were pretty much optimal across the board for each of these metrics, we would say, right, they're ready to do a power session. If they were down on a couple of those, mainly in the kind of the central nervous system response, we might put them into strength. And then if there's a number of areas that are down, such as their jump heights were much lower than they normally are, and then their CNS response from the readiness that we took was low, then we would say, right, they should only do some sort of maintenance session where they're just going through movement, but we're not looking to get performance gains today. So I guess just to summarize all of that, we want to be able to put people into buckets. But one of the hardest things within the human performance world right now is that much of this data is siloed. So sleep is typically collected on a wearable device, and it's often only available to the individual themselves. So sometimes the team doesn't even get to look at their sleep, and their only indication of sleep might come from a self-reported wellness. Getting a central nervous system measure, although there's a lot of technology out there that does it, again, maybe that's in a separate piece of software. So once you find out what the sleep was, you then have to go to a separate piece of software and find out, okay, what was their readiness from their CNS today. You then have to do your jump testing, which if that's not in the same location, that's a third place. And so as you can see, if all of these data sources are siloed, it creates a lot of extra work to try and get the information. And then to combine it is very, very challenging. And to build the algorithm that we built behind this, we needed all the data sets in the same place, which was super critical for us. And so this is the visual that we generated. But then one of the things is, for a coach that doesn't understand what these metrics are, which is very common, sleep is pretty straightforward. Everybody understands that. But central nervous system readiness, the values that we see here might make zero sense to a performance coach. And so what we tried to do was we just tried to simplify this whole thing into a visual here, which basically shows or plots each person into a quadrant in terms of their readiness. So if a coach is planning a session for a squad of athletes, they could see that sort of half of their squad was ready for power, but the other half was in kind of maintenance. So that allows them to make a decision either at a squad level to say, this is the type of session that we're going to do, or it allows you to individualize for each individual. And so if I hover over any of these, I can see some more information about that particular session or particular person who makes that up. So again, this is really great for someone who understands the data, and just putting people into buckets is very easy, but all of these numbers might overwhelm a coach. And so one of the things that we want to do is visualize that in a really simple way so that you can essentially just show a coach the picture of this graph and say, right, we recommend that based on this, this half of the squad can do the power session that we planned for them today. This half should probably do some sort of maintenance to decrease the injury risk in our team. So that's a great start. And again, you can do a lot with that information just by the fact that you're combining it all and putting it onto one simple visual. One of the things that this doesn't have for us is the ability to look at the trend over time for an individual. So I think, as we all understand, what you see today in terms of the flags for sleep, or the flags for training load, or the flags for wellness, are heavily impacted by the previous days that have come. So we know that if you have a poor night's sleep, your wellness is probably going to be low. We know that if your training load's been really high, that might affect just your jump heights and things like that. So we understand all of these things are interrelated, and the historical information is important. So one of the other things that you can do if you want to explore the data a little bit more is, if I scroll down here, I can look at an individual who I might see is flagging. And then what we've done is we've essentially taken the visual from above and just plotted them. So just for their CNS readiness versus their jump height, which are kind of two. One's an internal measure of readiness, and one's the external application of that readiness in a jump. And so again, what we saw was with the comparison between those two variables, we can safely say that this person is ready for power. So whereas up the top here, we were kind of taking into account the 5 key variables, down here, we're looking at the direct relationship between 2 key variables to see if what we've kind of indicated up the top here for the athlete is reflected in their trend data as well. And then what we can do is we can also look just at the longitudinal data. So right here, I'm looking at about 2 weeks of data. Now, the colors might be a little bit confusing, so I will spend a moment just explaining this. Each of the bars represents the type of session that we did. So you can see them listed out here, green being power, strength, maintenance, and recovery. And so what we can do is we can see what kind of CNS score they got. So they had some pretty good scores, and then they had a slight drop off. And then what kind of what kind of session we then did that day. So see here, we had a soreness flag. Although their readiness was high, we had a soreness flag pop up. So what we decided this was a recovery phase. And based on the 3 days prior, we made that decision. So again, what's important is the ability to overlay the data to see if there's a flag in the correlation between them, and then being able to make the decision. We also did the same with sleep, and again, jump height. So we wanted to see if the way that they slept impacted our decision to put them into a power session. And so as we can see here, based on the sleep that they had, we actually could make the argument that maybe they weren't ready for a power session. And so that's again where maybe 4 out of the 5 variables align, but we still want to be able to check that all of our variables are aligning. And again, just doing the same thing that we did above, kind of looking at their sleep score across that 2-week period, and the kinds of sessions that we did on those days based on the data that we saw. So again, you've gone from what's a kind of a squad view up here to allowing your sports scientist or even your coaches as well, if they've got the background, to be able to drive down into the individual view and look at that person's trend. So I guess just wrapping up on that dashboard, this is one of the reasons why you want to really be thinking about the philosophy that you take when you approach your program, and deciding on the technologies that you're actually firstly going to purchase or use, and then secondly, you know, how you're going to use them when you're looking at your data. James, I can see your hand up there, mate.
Yeah, I just want to tie this together with the presentation and the last webinar that we have with Dr. Marcus Colby. Marcus was talking about the injury risk profiles and how organizations go about developing that. And this is the reason why we put these two back to back, because Marcus spoke about understanding the questions or the problems that you have, and the problem being the basis of the question that you're trying to answer, which will then inform the data that you need to collect. So I think for those that didn't see last week's or last webinar that we did with Marcus Colby, that'll be some really nice information for you to understand the process behind how you go about asking those questions, and therefore then how you go about getting the answers to understand, okay, this is the data we need to collect to understand where people are at with respect to their risk of injury. And then some of those data points might also be important to put into an example like this, like what Dan has here, to be able to inform, all right, well, we need to collect these sort of data sets to help understand what our athletes are ready for or not ready for in the following session. So two very complementary sessions, and I encourage those that didn't see last session to take a look at that as well themselves.
Yeah, James, it's a great point. And I agree, like a lot of the variables that we're looking at here could very easily fit into an injury risk profile as well. And you just might look at them slightly differently. You might be looking for slightly different flag thresholds based on, whether you're looking for optimal performance versus injury. But a lot of the times you can be very efficient with the tech that you use and the data that you collect, because a lot of those data sets can be used to answer numerous questions in the performance space. Cool. So yeah, again, that's kind of one of the, I guess, the big dashboard I wanted to go through today and explain to everyone. So I think at this point, I'd love to open it up to some questions and get some discussion around this.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Thanks, Dan. So we have a question here actually. So the question goes, how is the load calculated and interpreted? So there is a reference made. So he or she is seeing Jamie Anderson being highlighted in red. So with a value of 173. However, his other matrices are relatively comparable to Lucas Martin, whereas Lucas has only a load of 67. Yeah, so basically the question is, yeah.
Yeah, correct. So in this particular example, we didn't weight load very highly. And the reason for that is the type of sessions we were looking at, I guess, weightlifting. We were looking at doing power sessions in the gym versus kind of high intensity sprint sessions on a field. And so training load to us in that perspective wasn't as important. Although it's a flag that we want to see, we didn't weight it very highly. What we're representing there for load is essentially a training stress balance. So Jamie Anderson in this case is at, basically 173% of what he's done on the average of his last 4 weeks. But again, because, if we were talking about, and I probably should have clarified that at the start, and this was kind of a power session in the gym versus a power session on the field. But if we were talking more about a field session, we may have weighted load a little bit higher, because we know there's a lot of research around high training loads and injuries in that situation. And I'm not saying like we didn't weight it at all, but it wasn't enough to move Jamie from a power session to a strength session, because we deemed that the CNS responsiveness and then his RSI, like his jumps, indicated that he was ready for a power session.
Thanks, Dan. I hope that answered to the question that was asked. Any other questions revolving what Dan has actually mentioned earlier as well? I guess there's no further questions, and I guess everything is quite pretty loud and clear. So I'm just saying this very slowly, just in case anyone's kind of typing in any questions.
Yeah, Daniel, I might just just before we wait as well, I might just add something else as well. I think one of the things that we really love to do as part of our role is actually have the conversations with organizations about what technology you're using. And it doesn't even have to be around any of our products. Like we're all sports scientists. We love the opportunity to just talk sports science. One thing I didn't do was use some of the examples that we've got. So a couple of the teams. So I work with a couple of baseball teams, Major League Baseball teams here in the US. And one of the groups that I work with is weights very highly the data that they get from their jump testing. So they use Vald's ForceDex plate jump plates, and for them, that's their responsiveness with RSI and their jump heights are really important to them to understand the force production they're going to get out of their pitches. So again, what they did was they researched the kinds of loads and the kinds of force that pitchers need to produce, and then what they do is they use the ForceDex to create a baseline for each of the pitchers, and then compare each pitcher to the baseline to say, are they ready to pitch today? And based on that, they use that to then make the decision with some of the other data sets they collect, like their wellness and things like that, hydration, to say, right, this person's ready to pitch today, or we need to give them another day of recovery. So again, that's just an example of starting with the key demands of your sport and working back to, right, what are the questions that I want answered, and then what are the data sets that are going to help me answer those questions. So yeah, definitely something I would encourage everybody to think about. And as I said, we're more than happy to share our experiences or just talk technology if that's what people are looking for as well.
Awesome. And probably just a question on my side as well. So, I mean, we talk about, the fantastic work that we can kind of do to derive meaningful information. So probably just for my reference or information, let's say some organization is really wanting to, I guess, get involved in this data collection and really analyzing of data sets and stuff. So let's say if I was head of a swimming academy kind of stuff. So, I mean, is there anything that you would recommend based on the extensive experience around swimming associations? I mean, how could I get it started, or what kind of, I guess, matrix or data sets could I probably delve into for a start?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really good question. So one of the big ones I think for swimming is load. And what I mean by that, you can quantify that any way you want. Whether it's laps swam, distance covered, things like that. That's obviously important from a mental side as well as a physical side. I don't know what the term is called, but swimmers stare at a black line all day as they're swimming, and sometimes that can actually have serious effects on them as well. Obviously, sleep is a massive thing with any athlete. I don't care what sport you play, what you do, sleep is absolutely critical. And there's some really great devices out there, Aura, Fatigue Science, Garmin, Polar. And I know I've forgotten some, and I apologize, I can't list them all off the top of my head, but there's a lot of devices that you can use for that. And ones that you can just put under your mattress as well, that are less invasive. I think outside of that, swimming's a different sport in that there's not, it's things like force plates and stuff like that doesn't really relate, because you're not putting force through the ground like you are with a sport like football or basketball or something like that. So I think there would be one of the other ones. I think one of the things that they do is, the ability to obviously measure performance time. So they'll do time trials, and they'll look at, when people are hitting their personal best in the pool, and try to periodize around that. So there are so many different data sets that you can use, but even just as a starting point, doing something simple like a wellness, getting some sort of load metric, whether it's distance covered or self-reported RPEs, a subjective questionnaire as well is a great place to start.
Yeah, I might just jump in there as well in terms of understanding a place to start. I'll reference the webinar from last session as well with Marcus Colby, and it's really, when people often ask where to start, some of the basic examples that Daniel just referenced is a fantastic place to start. Very simple. Another thing to consider is just looking at where your common stresses are. So taking a look at the injuries that are already taking place. Let's say in swimming, there's a lot of shoulder issues, in and around the rotator cuff, as an example, right? Well, then what can we do to start monitoring the health of our athletes, and in particular, the health of their shoulders, right? So how can we continue to monitor that and build that into our monitoring programs to ensure that we have nice, healthy shoulders amongst the group, and so on and so forth. So, another really nice place to start is to look at history, look at where you've come from, and look at where the high risks are and where the injuries have taken place, and then start putting data collection programs and monitoring programs around those risky elements within your sport.
Yeah, great point. And that's a very cost-effective way to do it as well. You can do a lot of physical assessments to understand readiness as well. Very, very common in professional sport as well. Something that the physical therapist or the physiotherapist will take the squad through. So yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, so we've just got another question that came through. So it asks, is it possible to add other matrices? So for example, we've got heart rate, HRR, heart rate recovery, we've got HRV, heart rate variability as well. So yeah, they're just exploring the options that whether they can kind of derive these matrices in.
Yeah, absolutely. Great, really good question. So I might deal with heart rate and then heart rate variability separate. So heart rate is actually, again, a pretty simple one. You can get pretty cheap and cost-effective heart rate monitors. Obviously, athletes can do their own resting heart rate in the morning. That was something that we used to see a lot of in the early days of this, where heart rate monitors were just kind of starting out. So yeah, definitely resting heart rate is a great indication of your readiness to train or your recovery, basically. If your resting heart rate is high, it's a really good sign of fatigue or stress. So again, a simple one and a cost-effective one. Heart rate variability, again, is a great one as well. That's used very commonly by a lot of these devices that I've already mentioned. It's a big metric for those in terms of their recovery scores. If your heart rate variability drops significantly, it's a sign of poor recovery. And then, a higher heart rate variability generally indicates a higher level of fitness and potentially readiness. So both of those metrics are really, really useful. And again, what one of the other questions you need to ask yourself in this is, do you have the ability to collect all of that data? Like, so you may want to collect 10 variables, but firstly, is collecting 10 variables cost effective or 10 data sets cost effective? And do you have enough time to collate it and analyze it effectively? And again, it's not like you may not be able to do that in the future, but if this is your first kind of look into this area, as James has already alluded to, starting with something very simple, things that are more cost effective and, easier to interpret, might be a great starting point. But certainly any of those metrics would be really valuable in any kind of performance or injury risk model.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. Any further questions before we wrap it up in the interest of time? Probably not. All right. So should you have any questions that comes to mind, please feel free to email across to myself at daniel.chan@fusionsport.com, and we'll definitely have Dan to answer to your queries from there as well. So yeah, I trust today's session has been beneficial for everyone here, and we definitely look forward to the next webinar. For any topics that you probably would be interested to know or want us to share about, please do send it through to us, that maybe we may look into it as well. So if not, then yeah, thank you so much once again for everyone to joining this session. So yeah, stay safe and stay healthy. Take care, guys.
Cool. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, James.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all.